Up next, we have Donald Madeline, representing U.S. Term Limits, speaking in favor.
Yes. I've got two hats on today.
Okay.
One is an educator, and one is a locally elected official from the Village of Windsor. With my education hat on, something that came back that I recalled a long time ago as a college president that we had to enforce was one of the overreaches by Congress and obviously the Department of Education, where we had to actually register every student for the draft. And if we didn't register students for the draft through the school, we were withheld federal funds, i.e. Pell Grants and other resources for other students. It was an administrative burden and it was really a pain, but we did it. The other component is I want to talk a little about it is today I've heard a lot of history, I've learned a lot, and I've also heard some interesting recitations and dramatic readings. But beyond that, early on when we were a fledgling republic, even before the Constitution was done, they talked about rotations in office. And the idea of term limits connected to the notion of rotation in office was popular during the early days of the American Republic. Founding area citizens viewed term limits as a means to prevent corruption and distant, entrenched interests staying permanently in power. They worried that a lack of change in higher office would be destructive to Republican government. And under the Articles of Confederation, term limits kept representatives to 3 terms in any 6-year period. So they had term limits even before the Constitution was in vogue. Obviously that didn't carry over because there were a lot of pros and cons and whether or not that was going to fulfill the arguments. And I have a couple of good, solid anecdotal stories I think that you may enjoy, is that I'm not only running on term limits. I have one more term to fulfill my obligation, and I think that's important to bring in fresh ideas, new ideas, people from outside. We can get a little stale sometimes. But a good friend of mine, who's also a fellow golfer, was a former congressman. Many of you may know Scott Klug. Mm-hmm. And I always say that you can always tell a gentleman by the way he golfs, because you have to call penalties on yourself. And he ran against, on a term limit basis, against Bob Kastenmeier, as you all recall. And Bob was in Congress from 1959 to 1991 for 32 years. And he wasn't anywhere close to the myriad, and I've ran down pages and pages and pages of congressmen and women that served for many, 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 many years, many of them minimum 32, 40, 50 years. Even Fred Risser, who has our record of 58 years, the longest serving legislator in America, doesn't hold a candle to John Dingell from Michigan, who served for 59 years. So this goes on and on and on, as we see in the government process. And today you've got Ted Cruz and you've got Governor DeSantis are proclaiming term limits, but there it's a cry in the wind. They all know what the end results are going to be. Congress is not going to implement term limits on itself. And therefore, Article 5, the Article 5 Convention and your Senate JR 12 is the means that we as the public, and as I as a servant, a public service and elected official, much like you, is the only means that we have of recourse. The others obviously have been done by Congress, the other 27, as we all know. This one needs to be done by the states. States need to reclaim their rights, their inherent rights, and hear the citizens, and you all represent them. So I hope you will take this up. It's interesting, the latest Gallup poll just came out, and Congress actually rose a little bit, up to about 35% approval rate, probably only because of the $1,400 in everybody's pockets that they got. That would maybe encourage me to maybe say nice things about my congressman at the time. But tonight we have a meeting with Congressman Pocan, and at 6 o'clock to talk about municipal things, and I'm afraid he's going to get an earful from me. So with that, I'll stop.
Well, thank you, and thank you for sticking around with your testimony.
A pleasure.
You know, they might try to bribe us with $1,400. per person, but they put us 14,000 more in debt per person.
Oh,
We're not talking about that.
No,
So
I have grandchildren, and I do not want to see the debt that they're going to incur.
I'm right there with you. Thank you for sticking around, and thank
Bless
you for
you
your
all.
testimony.
Thank you so much.
Okay, but